The city woke as it always did, unaware something irreversible had already happened behind closed doors. A former minister was found dead inside her own home, and the announcement came only after a delay that immediately made the silence feel intentional rather than accidental. That lag matters because it suggests the case was treated as more than a routine crime, and it raises the so what question: what kind of death forces caution before truth, especially under Ibrahim Traoré's era of tightened narrative control? If the silence breaks later, it will not break gently. What follows is not a crime recap and not a search for suspects. This part lays out the stakes of why this death matters now and why timing outweighs spectacle. When information is delayed in a system accustomed to public violence, that delay becomes a signal. It tells observers that the event intersects with power, memory, and unfinished political arrangements rather than random insecurity. The promise here is simple but heavy. By tracing silence instead of the blood, the story reveals how unresolved histories behave when a state is trying to redraw authority. This approach also avoids a common trap. Focusing on shock distracts from structure, while focusing on structure explains why shock is sometimes muted on purpose. The micro-hook is this: that if silence is a tool, then someone decided it was necessary. Understanding who benefits from restraint and who becomes vulnerable because of it reframes the death as a test of narrative control rather than a breakdown of order. The first revealing detail is not how the former minister died, but how little noise followed. In Ouagadougou, ordinary violence travels fast. This one did not. Hours passed, then more, before officials spoke. And when they did, the language was procedural, thin, and deliberately narrow. That restraint signals awareness that the death intersected with something larger than personal tragedy. It suggests the authorities already understood that details, once released, would not stay contained within one house or one night. To understand why, the figure herself matters less than what she represented. She belonged to an older political architecture that never fully collapsed after 2014. She governed regions, sat in parliament, and worked in areas where civilian authority overlapped with military and foreign interests. People in such positions accumulate memory rather than popularity. They know how decisions were justified internally, which compromises were normalized, and which actors operated behind the scenes. When regimes fall quickly, loud figures disappear. Quiet insiders remain as living archives. For years, that knowledge stayed dormant. She did not speak publicly, organize opposition, or challenge the present. But inactivity is not irrelevance. As Burkina Faso entered another phase of power consolidation under Ibrahim Traoré, unresolved figures shifted categories. They were no longer background, they became variables, not enemies, not allies, but sources of complexity at a moment when the state was seeking cleaner narratives and firmer lines. Her death only becomes legible inside that shift, where silence is less about hiding facts and more about managing what those facts could reopen. The guiding figure in this part is not the victim herself, but the environment that shaped her relevance. In fragile political systems, influence does not vanish when titles end. It changes form. Former insiders often retreat into private life, yet they continue to occupy invisible junctions between memory and authority. Their early impact is subtle. They remind current actors that decisions once made under pressure were never fully examined, only paused. This presence alone can create discomfort during periods of reorganization. One short case illustrates this dynamic. After the 2014 collapse of the old order, several high-profile figures fled or were prosecuted, creating an illusion of closure. Meanwhile, lower-profile insiders remained untouched, not because they were harmless, but because confronting them required reopening files the state was not prepared to audit. A second case followed years later, when security crises forced successive governments to prioritize survival over accountability. Again, unresolved histories were stored rather than addressed. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that balance began to shift. Consolidation required coherence. Coherence demanded selective simplification. In that context, people who embodied continuity without control became early pressure points. The so what is concise, that unresolved memory becomes risky when authority hardens. What followed unfolded as a sequence rather than a single act, and each stage narrowed the space for ambiguity. First came the activation. The killing occurred inside a private residence, contained, quiet, and without public disturbance. That alone signaled confidence. Whoever acted expected no interruption and no immediate exposure. Then came the pause. Hours turned into more than a day before authorities acknowledged the death. No alerts, no neighborhood lockdown, no urgency. In a capital used to sudden shocks, restraint stood out as deliberate. Silence became the first visible response, and that choice framed everything that followed. The climax arrived not through revelation, but through omission. When the statement was finally released, it offered confirmation without explanation. A former minister had been killed. An investigation was opened. Nothing more, no method, no timeline, no account of how access was gained or why alarms failed. This was not the language of reassurance or crisis management. It was the language of containment. Officials appeared less concerned with public reaction than with preventing the story from expanding upward toward networks and histories that could not be easily isolated. The aftershocks were quiet but wide. Within political circles, the message was absorbed without being stated. This was not random violence, not insurgency, not street instability. It was an event touching continuity between past and present. For insiders who carried unresolved knowledge from earlier regimes, the implications were clear. Silence was not protecting citizens, it was buying time. Time to assess which connections might surface if the wrong detail emerged too early. Time to decide how much of the past could be acknowledged without destabilizing the current order. This sequence only makes sense in the context of a power consolidation under Ibrahim Traoré. As authority tightened, the tolerance for historical ambiguity narrowed. Figures who once existed safely in the background became reminders of compromises never audited and decisions never fully justified. The killing did not announce a new era, it exposed the cost of transitioning without closure. Activation, pause, omission, and quiet absorption formed the pattern. And that pattern suggests the event was less about removing a person than about managing a moment when the past threatened to re-enter the present on its own terms. Evidence in this case is defined less by numbers than by contrast, and the contrast is clear when placed side by side. Before the killing, former insiders from earlier regimes occupied a neutral zone. They were known but inactive. They carried history, but that history was treated as stored rather than dangerous. After the killing, that neutrality fractured. Silence itself became evidence, because silence appeared only where disclosure would create secondary consequences. The shift is qualitative, but it is still measurable through behavior, tone, and sequence. Before, when ordinary violence occurred in Ouagadougou, authorities moved quickly to classify it. Statements were fast, framing was blunt, and the objective was reassurance. After this killing, the opposite pattern emerged. Communication slowed, language narrowed. Appeals for witnesses lacked urgency. This before-after difference matters because states rarely change communication posture without internal calculation. The explanation is not lack of information, but sensitivity to what information might connect to once released. Another contrast lies in investigative posture. In routine cases, emphasis is placed on method, suspects, and public cooperation. Here, emphasis rested on procedure without texture. An investigation was announced but not dramatized. That restraint suggests awareness that the act intersected with networks rather than individuals. Networks are harder to expose safely because they link decisions across time. In transitional systems, such exposure risks reopening debates the present leadership has not yet settled. This pattern aligns with the broader recalibration underway under Ibrahim Traoré. Authority consolidation depends on narrative coherence. Narrative coherence depends on limiting unresolved contradictions. Figures tied to older systems embody those contradictions simply by existing. Their knowledge creates asymmetry. They know how justifications were constructed internally, how foreign alignments were negotiated, and how security decisions were rationalized under pressure. That knowledge does not need to be spoken to matter. Its presence alone complicates simplified stories of rupture and renewal. The evidence then is not forensic but structural. Before, unresolved history was tolerated. After, it became risky. The killing marks that inflection. It indicates a moment when the cost of carrying the past quietly began to outweigh the cost of intervening discreetly. This does not assign guilt or intent. It clarifies context. The data point is the change itself. When silence replaces explanation and restraint replaces reassurance, the state is signaling that the danger lies not in public panic, but in what uncontrolled truth might expose upward and backward at the same time. A fair analysis has to confront the strongest alternative explanations, not dismiss them. One argument is straightforward. This was simply a criminal act in a country facing widespread insecurity. Violence has normalized, homes are breached, and former officials are not immune. From this view, the delay in communication reflects bureaucratic caution, not political calculation. Investigators may have lacked clarity, and restraint may signal professionalism rather than fear. In unstable environments, officials often avoid speculation to prevent panic or misinformation. A second counter-argument focuses on institutional limits. Transitional states frequently struggle with capacity. Delays can stem from coordination failures between police, prosecutors, and security services. Minimal statements may be a legal precaution to protect an investigation rather than a narrative strategy. From this angle, reading meaning into silence risks over-interpreting routine dysfunction. The absence of detail could simply reflect an early investigative phase where facts are incomplete and disclosure premature. Both arguments deserve weight. Random crime exists. Institutional weakness exists. However, neither fully explains the specific pattern observed here. In ordinary criminal cases, even under strain, authorities typically emphasize reassurance. They clarify whether the public faces risk, outline basic timelines, or frame the act within known categories like robbery or targeted assault. Here, that framing was notably absent. The communication was not just slow, but narrowly calibrated, offering confirmation without context. That choice suggests selectivity, not confusion. Capacity limits also fail to explain consistency. When states lack coordination, messaging tends to be messy, contradictory, or delayed unevenly. In this case, the tone was controlled and uniform. There was no emotional language, no alarmist framing, and no appeal designed to mobilize public cooperation urgently. Such discipline points to internal alignment rather than institutional drift. Most importantly, these counter-arguments do not account for timing. The killing occurred during a phase of power consolidation and narrative tightening under Ibrahim Traoré. In such moments, sensitivity to unresolved history increases. The risk calculus shifts from public order to elite exposure. Silence becomes a tool not because facts are unknown, but because their connections are known too well. Acknowledging these alternatives sharpens the conclusion rather than weakening it. Random crime and weak capacity may explain violence elsewhere. They do not explain why this death was treated differently. That difference is the signal that matters. The midpoint shift comes from a small but decisive realization. The silence was not defensive, it was preventative. Up to this point, restraint could be read as hesitation. Here it becomes clear that it functioned as a gate. Once that gate holds, the story stays bounded. Once it opens, the narrative stops being about a single death and starts pulling older decisions into the present. That is the board flip. The investigation was never just about finding answers, but about sequencing them. This reframes everything that came before. The lack of urgency was not weakness, it was timing. The narrow language was not emptiness, it was filtration. Authorities appeared to understand that certain truths, if released too early, would not clarify events but multiply them. Each detail would point backward into unresolved arrangements and sideways into still sensitive relationships. Under Ibrahim Traoré, this matters because consolidation depends on controlling when history re-enters the room. The reveal is not who acted, but why patience mattered more than speed. Silence is a delay, not a void. The practical consequences unfold across 4 layers, each absorbing the impact differently. At the state level, the immediate effect is narrative tightening. By delaying explanation, authorities preserved room to maneuver while assessing what disclosure might trigger. This protects short-term stability in Burkina Faso, but it also signals that unresolved history remains sensitive. Ministries and security services learn that certain cases are not processed for speed, but for containment. That lesson shapes future behavior, encouraging caution over transparency when past decisions risk resurfacing. For businesses and economic actors, the impact is indirect but real. Political uncertainty is not measured only by protests or coups. It is measured by predictability. When silence replaces clarity in high-profile cases, investors and local operators read it as a sign that informal power networks still matter. Contracts may hold, but confidence thins. Decisions slow. Risk premiums quietly rise, not because violence increased, but because explanation narrowed. Citizens experienced the effect differently. There was no panic, no visible unrest, but trust erodes subtly. When people see that some deaths are explained quickly, while others are handled with restraint, they infer hierarchy. Not all lives generate the same urgency. That perception deepens distance between public narratives and private understanding. People may not know the facts, but they sense selectivity. Regionally, the signal extends beyond borders. Sahel neighbors watch how Ibrahim Traoré's government manages continuity. Quiet handling reassures elites that transitions will be controlled, but it also reinforces the idea that unresolved paths are liabilities. That lesson travels. It shapes how other transitional authorities weigh truth against stability. Together, these effects show that the killing's significance lies less in disruption than in calibration. Power adjusted, communication narrowed, the system absorbed the shock without noise, but not without cost. Looking 6 to 12 months ahead, 3 plausible trajectories emerge, each shaped less by the crime itself than by how silence is sustained or relaxed. Restraint continues. Authorities release limited updates. The investigation remains formally open, and no definitive motive is named publicly. This path preserves short-term stability and avoids forcing premature reckonings. Under this outcome, the system absorbs the event as an anomaly rather than a rupture. The cost is gradual. Trust does not collapse, but it thins. Silence becomes normalized as a governance tool, especially for cases touching older power arrangements. The state gains time, but unresolved questions remain dormant rather than resolved. Disclosure comes later, but carefully framed. Once the political environment is judged resilient enough, selective facts are introduced to close the case without reopening broader histories. Accountability is contained, not expansive. This outcome strengthens institutional credibility by showing that patience leads to clarity, not permanent opacity. It also signals confidence. The present can acknowledge fragments of the past without losing control. This is the most difficult path because it requires internal consensus on how much truth can be safely carried forward. Silence fractures unexpectedly. A leak, testimony, or external report forces details into the open before the state is prepared to contextualize them. In that case, the narrative jumps backward abruptly, reviving unresolved debates from earlier regimes and linking them to current authority. What was meant to be contained becomes connective. The issue stops being one death and becomes a proxy for how transitions were managed after 2014. This path risks polarization among elites rather than unrest in the streets, but elite fractures are harder to repair quietly. Across all 3 scenarios, the key variable is not evidence but timing. The lesson for observers is to track when silence shifts, not whether it exists. In transitional systems, stability is not defined by how fast truth appears, but by whether truth arrives when institutions can absorb it without breaking. For viewers, the distance between high politics and everyday life can feel wide, but the effects land closer than they appear. For people already living with uncertainty, silence from authorities becomes another layer of cognitive cost. It forces individuals to interpret signals on their own, filling gaps with inference rather than information. Some disengage, assuming clarity will never come. Others become hyper-attentive, reading meaning into tone, timing, and omission. Neither response builds confidence. Both reflect adaptation to ambiguity rather than trust in process. Different groups absorb this differently. Younger citizens, shaped by years of disruption, may see restraint as normal and expect opacity as the default. Older generations who lived through previous transitions recognize the pattern and feel a familiar unease when history seems managed instead of addressed. Civil servants and professionals read the episode as guidance. It suggests which questions are safe, which memories are better left untouched, and how far initiative should go when past decisions are involved. 2 small neutral responses remain available to individuals. One is patience with attention. Instead of reacting to rumors, track consistency. Watch how language evolves, not just what is said. The other is collective memory. Conversations that preserve context without accusation help prevent silence from erasing complexity entirely. Neither action challenges authority directly, but reduces the long-term cost of uncertainty by keeping understanding distributed rather than buried. This moment is less about fear than about orientation. When explanation pauses, people recalibrate how they listen, what they expect, and where they place responsibility. That recalibration shapes civic behavior long after headlines fade. A workable path forward does not require dramatic gestures. It requires sequencing, role clarity, and measurement. The first step sits with institutions closest to the case. Investigators continue quietly, but with an internal deadline for review, not for public announcement. The measure here is completeness, not speed. Files are mapped, intersections identified, and risks assessed before disclosure decisions are made. This phase is about knowing what exists before deciding what can be said. The second step belongs to the executive layer. Under Ibrahim Traoré, coordination matters more than command. A small interministerial channel aligns legal, security, and communications actors so that messaging does not contradict process. The measure is consistency. When language stabilizes internally, it reduces the chance of accidental escalation externally. Silence becomes structured rather than improvised. Third comes conditional transparency. This is not full exposure, but calibrated release. Once the system determines which facts close the case without reopening unresolved chapters, those facts are introduced deliberately. The metric is containment. If disclosure answers more questions than it creates, the timing was right. If not, restraint continues. Fourth is institutional memory management. Archives tied to earlier regimes are indexed and safeguarded, not politicized. The goal is prevention, ensuring that unresolved history does not remain a latent threat that resurfaces through violence rather than process. Measurement here is procedural access rather than public debate. Finally, feedback matters. Authorities track public interpretation not through reaction, but through stability indicators. Trust does not require immediacy, it requires coherence over time. This path is slower, but it reduces the cost of postponement by replacing uncertainty with deliberate pacing. The story circles back to what first made this death unsettling, not violence, but restraint. The image that lingers is not a crime scene, but a closed house in a waking city, holding a past that was never fully sorted. That quiet return matters because it reveals how transitions actually end, not with declarations, but with decisions about what to carry forward and what to seal away. For years, unresolved figures existed as background noise. They neither threatened nor shaped the present. That balance held until authority hardened and memory became inconvenient. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the pressure was not to erase the past, but to simplify it. This death exposed the friction in that effort. It showed that history does not fade on command. It waits, embedded in people, files, and habits, until timing makes it visible again. The emotional weight lies in that delay. A life ended quietly because it stood at the intersection of continuity and control. The state chose pacing over explanation. Whether that choice leads to resolution or repetition depends on what happens next. History does not vanish. It negotiates. The final step is not a call to outrage or certainty. It is an invitation to pay attention differently. Moments like this test how societies listen when explanations slow down. They ask whether audiences demand speed at any cost or whether timing itself becomes part of the message. Under Ibrahim Traoré, restraint has been used as a governing language, and understanding that language matters more than choosing sides too quickly. For viewers, the value lies in pattern recognition. Notice which events are clarified immediately and which are handled with care. Notice when silence shortens and when it stretches. Those shifts reveal more about power than any single statement. They also shape how legitimacy is built or weakened over time. If this story raised new questions rather than answers, that is intentional. Transitional periods are defined by what is deferred, not just what is declared. Stay with the sequence. Track what changes and when. That patience turns observation into understanding and understanding into context.